Diplomacy used to sound like maps on a table. Borders. Shipping lanes. Trade access. Then it started sounding like technology transfers, supply chains, semiconductor fabs, and satellite constellations. And now, the soundtrack is shifting again. Because today, the most consequential thing a nation can possess isn't only territory or even industry. It's intelligence, the ability to see patterns before others do, to predict the next move, to influence decisions at scale, and to coordinate action faster than rivals. And here's the twist. Nations aren't just negotiating with diplomats and documents anymore. They're negotiating with models. With simulations. With predictive systems. With autonomous agents that can propose options, generate talking points, detect vulnerabilities, and forecast outcomes in real time. So what happens when intelligence itself becomes the arena? When negotiation becomes partly machine to machine, partly human to machine, and partly human to human under the pressure of machine speed? Tonight, we're stepping into the rise of intelligence diplomacy, the new domain where influence is engineered, alliances are rewired, and global power gets shaped long before anyone signs a treaty. Welcome back to the BI channel. I'm your host, 𝗓𝗓𝗵𝗲. This episode is about one of the most transformative geopolitical shifts of the 21st century, how nations negotiate, collaborate, and compete in a world where intelligence becomes the primary instrument of power. Not just intelligence as in spies and secrets. I mean intelligence as systems, data pipelines, models, inference engines, cognitive tools, algorithmic persuasion, decision automation, and the infrastructure that makes all of it work. We're going to break down what intelligence diplomacy is, why it's emerging now, and what risks and opportunities it creates. And I'm joined by three guests who see this from very different, very complementary angles. First, Stella Sinclair. Executive strategist focused on human-centered intelligence. Stella, welcome back.
Thanks, 𝗓𝗓𝗵𝗲. I'm excited for this one, because we're watching a new level of global strategy form in real time. Intelligence diplomacy isn't a niche topic anymore. It's starting to determine alliances, influence, even stability.
Joining us as well, Dr. Elena Ruiz. Clinical Intelligence and Cognitive Systems Specialist. Dr. Ruiz, great to have you here.
Glad to be here. The part of this conversation that's often missed is cognition. Diplomacy is not just policy and power. It's perception, trust, identity, fear, reassurance. And intelligent systems increasingly shape those psychological conditions.
And finally, 𝗂𝗵𝗵. AI systems architect and simulation futurist. Aiden, welcome.
Thanks, 𝗓𝗓𝗵𝗲. I put it bluntly, nations are increasingly negotiating with intelligence architectures, not just with each other's policies. That changes the pace, the leverage points, and what it even means to make an agreement.
Alright. Let's build the foundation. Segment 1, what is intelligence diplomacy? We've used the word intelligence in politics forever. But we're carrying something new into diplomatic space, toolkits that don't just collect information, they generate analysis, propose actions, and sometimes execute decisions. Stella, if you had to define intelligence diplomacy out loud, in plain language, what is it?
I think of it as diplomacy, where intelligence systems become instruments of statecraft. So it's not only about what you know. It's about what your systems can do with what you know. How quickly you can interpret signals, forecast outcomes, and influence a counterpart's choices. And, importantly, intelligence here includes data access, model capability, computational infrastructure, human expertise, and governance. The diplomatic leverage is the whole stack.
The whole stack. That's a strong phrase. Dr. Ruiz, when Stella says the stack includes governance and influence, it hints at the mind. How do you define it from your angle?
I would define it as diplomacy conducted inside a cognitive environment that's mediated by intelligent systems. In the past, negotiation relied on human interpretation, reading tone, making sense of uncertain facts, managing ambiguity. Now, a lot of interpretation is outsourced to systems that rank likelihoods, recommend narratives, translate context, and calculate risk. That changes the psychology of negotiation. It changes what each party believes is true. It changes what each party feels is safe. And it changes the nature of trust, because trust becomes entangled with the tools.
So you're saying we're not only negotiating across borders, we're negotiating through interfaces.
Exactly. Interfaces and the cognitive framing they impose.
Aiden, translate this into systems language. What's different now compared to classic diplomacy?
Two things. First, the object of negotiation is changing. It used to be territory, resources, obligations. Now nations bargain over access to models, compute, data sharing, interoperability standards, and the ability to embed intelligence into everything from border security to financial regulation. Second, the mechanism of negotiation is changing. Negotiators use simulations to test proposals before they ever reach the table. They use agents to draft and iterate. They use predictive analytics to model the other side's constraints. So diplomacy becomes partly a contest of who has better forecasting and better optimization. And that's why I say it's negotiation with intelligence architectures.
Let's slow down on that. Because if it's a contest of forecasting, then the strongest diplomats aren't only the most persuasive humans, they're also the ones with the best models. Stella, is this just a fancier version of traditional intelligence services supporting negotiation? Or is it actually a different category?
It's different. Traditional intelligence supports diplomacy by informing it. Intelligence diplomacy is when intelligence capability becomes part of the bargain itself. Think of it like this. Historically, you might negotiate a trade deal, and intelligence would tell you whether the other side is bluffing. Now you might negotiate a trade deal, and the real prize is access to the platforms that will run the trade system, fraud detection, supply chain prediction, sanctions enforcement, and economic forecasting. If you share those systems, you're not just sharing information. You're sharing power.
That's the line. Sharing power. Let's move to segment 2, intelligence as a new diplomatic currency. We understand money. We understand oil. We understand shipping routes. Those things are currencies in a geopolitical sense because they can be traded for influence. When we say intelligence is a currency, what exactly is being traded? Aiden, start us off.
Sure. The currency isn't a single thing, it's bundles. One bundle is access. Access to data sources, to satellite imagery, to maritime tracking, to cybersecurity telemetry, to language corpora. Another bundle is capability, model quality, compute scale, deployment at the edge, integration into state systems. A third bundle is trust infrastructure, standards for auditing, verification mechanisms, secure enclaves, identity systems. A nation might say, we'll give you access to our maritime intelligence feed if you align with our standards and allow interoperability with our models. That's a trade. And it locks in long-term dependence.
So the currency has a lock-in effect. Like once you're using the same rails, it's hard to switch.
Exactly. Interoperability is a silent treaty.
Stella, if intelligence is a currency, what's the equivalent of a central bank? Who sets the value?
That's the uncomfortable part. The value is set by whoever controls the standards, the infrastructure, and the perception of reliability. If your model is seen as the trusted model for risk scoring, for example, other countries build policy around it. If your cybersecurity classification becomes the default, it shapes who is labeled safe or dangerous. If your data sharing platform becomes the hub, you become the center of gravity. So the central bank is partly technical institutions, partly alliances, and partly the narrative ecosystem that convinces everyone your intelligence is legitimate.
And legitimacy is psychological. People forget that. A currency works because people believe it will hold value tomorrow. Intelligence currency works because decision-makers believe the system's outputs are stable, fair, and aligned with reality. If that belief collapses, because of bias, manipulation, failure, or scandal, the currency devalues. And then you get diplomatic volatility.
So intelligence can inflate and crash.
Yes, and the crash can be sudden. Think about what happens when a society finds out a key system was compromised, or when a model was quietly steering outcomes. Trust doesn't decline linearly, it breaks.
Let's make this concrete. Give me an example scenario, without naming specific countries. Stella, imagine a mid-sized nation negotiating a security partnership with a larger bloc. Where does intelligence currency show up?
The smaller nation might be offered access to a shared threat intelligence cloud, cyber indicators, disinformation detection, border analytics. In exchange, the bloc might ask for local data integration, hosting rights, or policy alignment. It might require the smaller nation to adopt certain identity standards or content governance frameworks. On paper, it looks like security cooperation. In practice, it's entering an intelligence economy where the bloc sets rules and the smaller partner becomes dependent on the shared system to operate safely.
And that changes domestic sovereignty too.
Yes, because sovereignty isn't only borders. It's decision autonomy.
Dr. Ruiz, you mentioned cognition earlier. Where does cognition become part of this currency exchange?
Influence becomes a bargaining chip. If you can shape how populations interpret events, what they fear, who they trust, what they perceive as legitimate, you can stabilize or destabilize negotiations. So a country might quietly negotiate cooperation against extremism or conflict escalation, but the real exchange is narrative infrastructure, shared systems for content detection, rumor control, sentiment analysis, and rapid messaging. And that's tricky, because it can be protective, reducing violence, reducing polarization, but it can also become a route to mass persuasion without meaningful consent.
Which leads us into segment 3, negotiation in an AI-accelerated world. Let's talk about the tempo. Diplomacy used to be deliberately slow. It had rituals, delays, careful wording. But AI compresses time. It pushes leaders to respond faster, because everyone knows the other side can iterate scenarios instantly. Aiden, does AI speed up negotiation, or does it make it stuck in infinite analysis?
Both. It speeds up the production of options, drafts, counterproposals, risk assessments, rhetorical framing. But it can also lock negotiators into optimization loops. If every option is simulated, you can always find a slightly better one. That can paralyze decision-making. There's also a strategic issue. If one side can compute faster, it can pressure the other side with rapid cycles, making them respond before they validated assumptions.
So time becomes leverage.
Exactly. And you can see the emergence of what I'd call tempo warfare, winning by compressing the opponent's decision window.
If I can add something, tempo warfare isn't only technical. It's cognitive. Human brains have limits. When leaders are forced into faster decisions, they rely more on heuristics. They become more vulnerable to framing effects, fear-based messaging, and perceived urgency. So the side that can manufacture urgency, or the side whose systems generate more convincing urgency, can drive negotiations toward outcomes that aren't necessarily rational in the long term.
That's chilling, the idea that urgency itself can be engineered. Stella, what does a negotiation table look like now? Are we literally imagining AI tools sitting in the room?
In some form, yes. Maybe not a robot in a chair, but a stack of systems. You'll have live translation, credibility scoring of claims, real-time media monitoring, scenario forecasting, and behind the scenes, teams are running simulations of the other party's likely response. The negotiator still speaks, but the negotiator is increasingly an interface for an internal intelligence pipeline.
And if both parties bring their own pipelines, the negotiation becomes two competing analytics engines plus two human identities trying to preserve dignity and face.
That's a good way to put it, yes.
Aiden, you mentioned simulations as tools. Walk me through this. How would a simulation change the way a nation commits to an agreement?
A nation can simulate outcomes across multiple dimensions. If we sign this treaty, what happens to energy prices? What happens to migration flows? How does misinformation campaign likelihood change? How do third parties react? What's the probability of domestic backlash? What's the impact on military readiness? The moment you can run thousands of variants, you stop thinking in terms of a single agreement. You think in distributions. And then negotiation becomes about which distribution of futures you prefer, and what risks you're willing to accept.
But the simulation also creates a psychological trap. If leaders see a model output that looks authoritative, they can overtrust it. The system's confidence can become contagious. And when a negotiation involves moral, cultural, or historical issues, simulations can't compute meaning. They compute proxies. The danger is that proxies start to stand in for values.
Let me challenge that, 𝗓𝗓. Some people might argue values are always proxied in diplomacy anyway. It's always about interests.
Interests are not independent of values. They're shaped by them. A diplomatic concession might be strategically optimal on paper but psychologically impossible because it violates identity. AI can identify what is optimal under certain assumptions, but it cannot guarantee that humans can live with the outcome. And if negotiators ignore the cognitive layer, agreements become brittle. They look stable until they shatter.
So the new diplomatic skill is not only reading the room. It's reading the room plus reading the model, and knowing where each can mislead you. Segment 4, Intelligence Alliances and Global Power Blocks. We've had military alliances, trade blocks, security arrangements. But now we're watching something different, alliances formed around data sharing, model interoperability, and common standards for AI governance. Stella, what is an intelligence alliance, in your view?
It's an agreement, formal or informal, to share intelligence capabilities, not just information. That means shared datasets, shared platforms, shared monitoring systems, shared cybersecurity infrastructure, shared standards for verification, and sometimes shared decision tools. The alliance becomes a living network. It's not only a defense pact, it's an operational nervous system.
An operational nervous system. That implies sensitivity. If it's a nervous system, it can feel pain. Aiden, what makes an intelligence block different from an old-school block?
Interoperability and dependency. In the past, allies might coordinate on tactics or share hardware. Now, if your systems are interoperable, your identity infrastructure, your threat warning platforms, your sanctions compliance engines, you can coordinate much faster. But the flip side is dependency. If you're integrated into a block's intelligence backbone, leaving becomes expensive. You can't just walk away from the system that runs your border analytics, your financial compliance, your counter-disinformation. So membership becomes sticky in a new way.
𝗓𝗓, where do you see power in these blocks? Is it just compute and data, or is it something more human?
Power is also narrative alignment. Blocks develop shared interpretations of events, shared vocabulary, shared threat definitions. If your systems label something a coordinated influence operation, and everyone in your alliance accepts that label, you've created a collective perception. That perception shapes policy. So block power includes the ability to define reality, not just respond to it.
Define reality. That's a fundamental diplomatic weapon. Stella, can these alliances be positive? We've talked about risks. But what's the constructive version?
Absolutely, they can be positive. If done ethically, intelligence alliances can help with early warning for pandemics, climate disasters, cyber attacks, financial instability, and conflict escalation. They can also lower mistrust. If countries share verification mechanisms, joint monitoring, shared audits, transparent standards, then suspicion decreases. The constructive version is cooperative intelligence with safeguards, clear limits, oversight, and human-centered governance.
Aiden, let's talk about one specific phrase you used earlier, interoperability as a silent treaty. Can you unpack that with an example?
Sure. Imagine multiple countries adopt the same technical standard for content authenticity. Say, a system that verifies whether an image or a video is signed by a trusted source. On the surface, it's a text standard. But if that standard is governed by one block, it can shape who is deemed credible globally. Or take cross-border financial monitoring. If member states integrate their compliance AI, then sanctions enforcement becomes more automated. That's a political commitment embedded in code. So the treaty isn't only on paper. It's in the protocols.
Which means a protocol change can carry the same weight as a clause edit. Segment 5, Risks, Tensions, and Escalation Dynamics. This is the part where we stop admiring the machinery and look at failure modes. Stella, you said earlier that escalation can happen faster than humans can manage. Why?
Because intelligence systems compress detection and response. If your systems flag an anomaly, say, a cyber pattern or troop movement or market manipulation, leaders may feel compelled to respond immediately. But what if the signal is wrong? Or what if it's engineered to be misread? In a high-speed environment, misunderstandings become dangerous faster. And on top of that, AI-enabled influence campaigns can spark domestic pressure. A leader might face sudden public outrage amplified by algorithmic targeting that pushes leaders toward decisive, sometimes aggressive moves. So escalation isn't only military. It's informational, economic, and psychological.
Elena, talk to me about cognitive warfare in this context. What does it mean when you say populations can be influenced without awareness?
It means persuasion can happen at scale, invisibly. Not through one propaganda poster, but through thousands of micro-interactions, recommended content, manipulated context, selective amplification, emotion-triggering narratives. If a population is gradually guided to distrust institutions, to demonize an outgroup, or to see compromise as betrayal, diplomacy becomes harder. Leaders have less room to negotiate because their people won't accept the settlement. So cognitive warfare can be used to sabotage agreements before they're even signed.
That turns citizens into terrain.
Yes. And when citizens are terrain, ethical boundaries become central. Because the most effective influence operations are the ones that don't feel like influence operations.
Aiden, what about systemic vulnerability? You mentioned that if one nation's intelligence infrastructure is compromised, the whole bloc is exposed.
This is the security paradox of integration. When you build shared model infrastructure, shared data lakes, shared identity services, shared monitoring dashboards, you create incredible coordination benefits. But you also expand the blast radius of a breach. If an attacker compromises a shared update pipeline, it could poison models across countries. If they infiltrate a shared telemetry feed, they can inject false signals. If they manipulate shared risk scoring, they can trigger automated decisions, sanctions, alerts, shutdowns. So the bloc becomes as strong as its weakest operational security and governance.
And it's not just about hacking. There's also the risk of subtle corruption, data poisoning, benchmark manipulation, quiet bias insertion. Aiden, do you think nations will start demanding model inspections the way they demand weapons inspections?
Yes, or at least they'll attempt it. But it's complicated. You can inspect a missile. You can count warheads. You can verify certain physical properties. Inspecting a model is harder because behavior can be contextual. A model can behave safely on test sets and dangerously in deployment conditions. Also, the most valuable aspects may be proprietary or classified. So we'll likely see negotiation over verification mechanisms, audits, red teaming, secure evaluation environments, watermarking, provenance tracking.
And that opens a new theater of diplomacy, the diplomacy of audits. Countries will argue about what counts as sufficient evaluation, who can perform it, what data is allowed, and what transparency is safe. Even the definition of safety can be contested, because safety is political.
Let's name another risk, miscalculation driven by mirror imaging. If both sides have predictive models of the other side, they might assume the other side is rational in the same way. But models are trained on history, and diplomacy often breaks history. Elena, how does miscalculation emerge psychologically in AI-accelerated negotiation?
It emerges when people outsource uncertainty. Negotiation is messy. It requires tolerating ambiguity. AI systems can create the illusion that ambiguity has been resolved by a number, a probability, a confidence score. If leaders believe those numbers too strongly, they stop asking basic human questions like, what does the other side need to feel respected? What does their public need to hear? What historical trauma is being triggered here? Models don't feel humiliation. People do. And humiliation is one of the fastest routes to escalation.
That sentence should be printed on the wall of every negotiation room. Stella, are we also seeing the emergence of intelligence brinkmanship? Like, displaying AI capability the way nations display military capability?
Yes. Demonstrations, leaks, strategic announcements, and public benchmarks can all function as signaling. A nation might showcase a new cyber defense model or a swarm simulation capability to deter adversaries. But there's a danger. Capability signaling can provoke arms race dynamics. If every side feels it must demonstrate superiority, then restraint becomes politically costly. And in intelligence systems, capability can be opaque. That means others may assume worst case. And worst-case assumptions drive escalation.
So we have speed, opacity, and dependency, 3 ingredients for instability. Segment 6, the future of global intelligence cooperation. This is where we look for exits, guardrails, and constructive pathways. If intelligence is becoming the core diplomatic currency, we need new rules. Maybe new treaties. Definitely new norms. Stella, what does a realistic cooperative framework look like?
I think it has to be layered. At the highest layer, multilateral standards for evaluation, auditability, and accountability. Not just voluntary principles, but processes that can be inspected. At the operational layer, shared early warning systems for global risks, pandemics, climate shocks, cyber cascades, where cooperation is clearly beneficial. And at the human layer, commitments to protect populations from manipulative cognitive operations, including transparency expectations and limits on targeting. The challenge is designing frameworks that are flexible enough for innovation but strict enough to prevent harm.
Elena, you mentioned something earlier that I want to spotlight, cognitive rights treaties. That's a powerful phrase. What are cognitive rights in an age of AI diplomacy?
Cognitive rights are protections for mental autonomy. In a world where systems can predict behavior, influence emotions, and shape perception, individuals need rights that go beyond privacy. That includes the right to not be covertly manipulated at scale. The right to know when you're interacting with automated persuasion. The right to transparency around highly consequential decision systems. If nations can agree that certain cognitive interventions are unacceptable, especially against civilian populations, that could reduce escalation and protect democratic legitimacy.
Aiden, from a technical standpoint, what would global intelligence protocols look like? People hear that and imagine science fiction.
It can be practical. Global intelligence protocols could mean standardized ways for systems to exchange claims with provenance, uncertainty estimates, and verification hooks. For example, when one country's system issues an alert about a cyber threat, the alert includes evidence metadata, confidence calibration, and a standardized method the receiver can use to validate. Or cross-border negotiation systems might include constraints. They can propose terms, but they cannot finalize without documented human authorization. They can simulate outcomes, but they must disclose key assumptions. Protocols like this reduce misinterpretation and make cooperation safer.
So diplomacy becomes partly about designing how systems talk without accidentally starting a crisis.
Exactly. Machine-to-machine communication is powerful, but it needs governance. Without it, we risk automated escalation.
Let's go deeper into automated escalation. We increasingly have automated systems in finance, cybersecurity, and defense. If those systems are coupled to diplomatic signaling, they can respond to each other. Elena, what happens cognitively when humans supervise automation but don't fully understand it?
You get supervision theater. Humans are present, but their role becomes ceremonial. If an automated system produces outputs at a speed and complexity humans can't evaluate, humans start rubber stamping. Then accountability becomes blurred. If something goes wrong, leaders blame the system, engineers blame policy, and citizens lose trust. Real oversight requires time, interpretability, and the courage to slow down. That's not a technical problem alone, it's cultural.
Stella, can diplomacy be redesigned to include strategic slowing? Like, deliberate friction?
It has to. We need negotiation norms that recognize when machine speed is destabilizing. Things like mandatory cooling off windows for certain categories of response, shared verification pauses, and structured channels for crisis clarification. In older diplomacy, there were back channels and rituals that prevented accidental war. We need equivalent mechanisms for AI-mediated environments. And we should treat certain systems the way we treat nuclear infrastructure, with redundancy, strict controls, and clear chains of authorization.
Aiden, I'm going to ask the blunt question people at home are already thinking. If intelligence is power, won't nations refuse to cooperate? Won't they keep everything secret?
They'll cooperate where incentives align. No one wants global cyber cascades that crash financial systems. No one wants pandemics to spread undetected. No one wants satellite collision chains that knock out navigation. So cooperative intelligence will emerge around shared vulnerabilities and shared catastrophes. But for competitive domains, military advantage, economic advantage, expect secrecy, deception, and capability races. The goal is to create partial cooperation that reduces existential risk without pretending we've ended geopolitics.
Elena, does partial cooperation work psychologically? Or does it create a false sense of trust?
It can work if it's honest. Trust isn't binary. You can trust a counterpart to share pandemic signals and not trust them to share military intelligence. That's normal. The problem is when cooperation is framed as friendship. That creates betrayal narratives when interests diverge. So psychologically, the healthiest approach is clear scope. We cooperate here because it protects us all, and we compete there because we have different goals. Clarity reduces paranoia.
Stella, what's one principle you'd put at the center of intelligence diplomacy, if leaders were listening right now?
Human outcomes first. If intelligence systems enhance power but destabilize societies, you don't get security, you get fragility. Diplomacy should measure success not just in advantage, but in resilience. Economic resilience, cognitive resilience, institutional resilience. If intelligence diplomacy is only about domination, it will produce cycles of escalation. If it's about resilient coexistence, it can build stability.
Aiden, one principle from you.
Verification over vibes. In a world of synthetic media and persuasive systems, we need verifiable signals, provenance, audits, shared testing, transparent uncertainty. If we can't verify, we'll assume deception. And if we assume deception, we'll escalate.
Elena, one principle.
Protect cognition. If diplomacy becomes a war over attention and perception, we all lose. Cognitive autonomy is a foundation of legitimacy, peace, and democratic stability. So any intelligence framework should treat the mind as something worth defending, not as a resource to mine.
Let's pull the threads together. Intelligence diplomacy is not just the next chapter of geopolitics. It's a shift in what power looks like. Power becomes the ability to sense and predict. To coordinate through networks. To influence narratives. To integrate systems across borders. And to act at machine speed while keeping humans meaningfully in control. But every advantage carries a shadow. If intelligence becomes currency, it can also become coercion. If simulations guide policy, they can also create false certainty. If alliances share infrastructure, they can also share vulnerabilities. And if speed becomes the norm, mistakes can escalate before anyone has time to breathe. So the future of negotiation will depend on something paradoxical, building the most advanced intelligence systems we can, while also building the discipline and governance to slow down when it matters. Stella Sinclair, Dr. Elena Ruiz, 𝗵𝗵, thank you for bringing your perspective to this conversation.
Thanks, 𝗍𝗵𝗲. This topic is only going to grow, and I'm glad we approached it as both strategy and responsibility.
Thank you. I hope listeners take away that diplomacy is always human, even when machines are involved.
appreciate it, no. The systems layer is here. The question is whether we govern it wisely.
And thank you for listening to the BI channel, where data meets decisions. If this episode made you think differently about diplomacy, send it to someone who cares about global stability, tech governance, or the future of negotiation. Until next time, stay curious. And remember, in the age of AI, intelligence isn't just something you have. It's something you negotiate.